My name is Robert Broene. I was a Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy. I went in June of 1966 and retired July 1987. I always wanted to be a sailor. As far back as I can remember, I never wanted to be a cowboy or a policeman or a fireman. I wanted to be a sailor. I would see TV shows or movies of a great gray ship slipping out of port in a misty morning, and I think, I want to be on that. And then in the 50s, there came a show. I really would have liked to have been a naval aviator, but my eyes were never going to let that happen. But a show came up called The Silent Service. I would still recommend. You can find it on YouTube. It's worth watching. But it's true stories of submarines in World War II. And a lot of times they bring on the people who were actually on board at the time. And it was filmed on a real submarine. So it was really, really well done. And it just, it hooked me on that. Well, I was, when you go into boot camp, as part of boot camp, they give you 3 days worth of tests. And then they've got about 2 days of telling you about all the different ratings in the Navy, all the different jobs. And then you go see a counselor and you match up what you want with your test scores and what the Navy needs. And they decide what path you're going to go down. And one of them was CT, which at that time was communications technician. Later they changed it to cryptologic technician. But the one that interested me was it was for linguists, and you would learn a foreign language. So I said, I'd like to do that. And my language scores were good, so they said, okay, which language? I said, Russian, Chinese, the main enemy. So they gave me Chinese Mandarin. And I went to language school, and then here at Goodfellow, and then to Okinawa, which is where I met my wife, who grew up 60 miles away from me in Michigan, but we met in Okinawa. And a year and a half on Okinawa, I said, no, I don't like Chinese. They don't have a Navy. This is kind of boring, and the only duty stations I have, really, were Okinawa, Taiwan, or the Philippines. So I said, I'll re-enlist if you give me Russian. And I said, oh, they won't do that. They don't give two major languages. You'll have to get Vietnamese or something. Ask them. Can't hurt. And they said yes. So I went back for Russian and did the school cycles again, and then was stationed in Japan and Scotland. 2 tours at Goodfellow as an instructor. Oh, there's quite a few. I love going to sea. As I like to tell people, the best sea stories are those that were not fun at the time. And bear in mind, you know the difference between a sea story and a fairy tale? A fairy tale begins once upon a time. A sea story begins, this is no lie. But I've had some interesting close calls. I got catapulted off an aircraft carrier, and they didn't have enough steam in the catapult. And my friends who were still on the carrier said, we went off the ramp and just dropped completely out of sight. So we had to have fallen at least 35, 40 feet, and there's only 80 feet. So between you and the water. So that was kind of, and it wasn't scary at the time because there's no windows. I didn't know until the ship pulled into port and they came and saw me again. It was on a destroyer in the Sea of Japan, in the edges of a typhoon, not in the typhoon proper. But nevertheless, we set the ship's record and a personal best and rolled 56 degrees. And in World War II, a couple of ships rolled 60 and never came back.
Wow.
So that was interesting. I was in a submarine that got tangled up in a fishing net, and we had to pull way out to sea and surface and have guys go over the side and cut the net off. But you could hear it in sonar. You could listen to the ship's noise, and you could hear the net swishing along behind you. One of the interesting ones was the Soviets had a ship called a Krivak, and a Krivak's goal in life was to kill submarines. That's what it was built for: find and kill submarines. And the submarines have that sail, the piece that sticks up vertically. And from the very top back corner of the sail, you can stream a floating wire antenna, which is about a half an inch in diameter. And so if you stream about 400 feet of floating wire, you can go down to at least 100 feet and still receive HF signals. And it's stored on a big reel right across from radio. And there's an amplifier at the very tip, silver amplifier, and one about 50 feet in. So the Krivak story, we were watching this Krivak just to see what he was doing. And he was coming toward us, and the captain called up on the radio and said, "Do you have anything from this guy?" I said, "No, we got nothing." He goes, "I think it's just coincidence. I don't think he knows we're here. I'm just going to drop the scope and let him go by." And he went over, you could hear it just like in the movies, the train, room, 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 room. And my harbor master said, "Lost signals on the floating wire." So I called control and said, "We lost signals on the floating wire." They said, "Retrieve the wire." So we pulled it in. And by measuring how much it came in, we realized he passed right over us about 30 feet after the sail and cut the wire and never knew we were there. This book was published by the Navy League. It celebrates the 100th anniversary of submarines in the Navy. And as I was reading through it, I found this, Garfield's Trails and Echo. This I can tell you about pretty completely because it's in an open source now, so I don't have to worry about going to prison or paying a $10,000 fine. But an Echo 2 was a Soviet guided missile, a cruise missile type submarine. It carried 8 cruise missiles. It had to surface in order to fire. But they had a range of 300 miles and they were designed to kill carriers. That's what they were all about. This was the Soviets. They had no way to kill a carrier, really, because they had none of their own. So this was their answer to that. And it was 1972 and we were patrolling off Vladivostok, and all of a sudden the Soviet Pacific Fleet went crazy. Ships coming out of harbor, coming out of port, just and we did something I've never done any other time, just that one time. And there's messages have precedences. So if it's more important, you can give it a higher precedence, it'll go out sooner. Most people think flash is the highest. There's one above it called critic. And we sent a critic. And this is information that's so essential that from the time it arrives at the National Command Center in Washington, they've got 15 minutes, I think, might be 10 or 15 minutes to get it in the hands of the president. And we said, "We don't know what's going on. What do you want us to do?" And one of the ships that sortied was that Echo, and it looked like it was headed south. Well, President Nixon had mined Haiphong Harbor, and it really spun the Soviets up. And the answer came back, "Follow that Echo." Well, waiting for the message to come back, we lost it, but we went, it's got to go through the Tsushima Strait. So we raced south to the Tsushima Strait and set up a patrol, sprint and drift, listening for it, picked it up. We followed it all the way down to Vietnam. They never knew we were there. And it was like the hunt for Red October in those days. You had to follow close. And they did Crazy Ivans. And when it became very obvious that they were going to the Vietnam area, we got orders that if that submarine tries to surface, sink it. Because if they surfaced, we would assume they were going to be surfacing to launch their weapons at our carriers. And so fortunately for them, they did not have to surface for some other reason. But they went down there and just spent a little bit and then headed back north. It was just apparently a knee-jerk reaction, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, the commanding officer of that Echo submarine got a copy of this book. And just like I turned the page and went, wow, that was me. I did that. He turned the page and went, wow, that was me. I was being followed. And he put out a thing on a blog and said, you know, they just told him, go south and prepare to assist our socialist allies. Actually, yeah, I do have one other. It deals with that floating wire again that I talked about earlier. And normally, it was on Swordfish, which was an old boat at the time. I mean, it was run shallow, run noisy. And so we got word, okay, the trouble with having a floating wire out is it restricts your speed maneuverability. So if you want to change locations at speed, you got to reel it back in, put it back on, or stow it, and you can go. And what happens is it goes through a tube that's just about the size of the wire, and it's got a rubber seal on the end. And you don't go very deep with this extended. If you want to go deep, you got to reel it in. And to keep sea pressure from coming down, and I mean there's a little drippage, but it just goes into the bilges and you pump it around. But there's a ball valve. Okay. There's a ball valve you shut, and that's what's designed to keep the ocean where it's supposed to be. So I said, retrieve the wire. So Radioman and I went out, and it took two of us because the boat was broken. And it's supposed to have it all done electrically, but it didn't. So I would turn the crank, and he would lay the wire in neatly. And it's supposed to have a little counter that tells you how much you put out and how much is in. But, you know, that was part of the electrical system. It wasn't working. So what we're going to do is, it's about 50 feet from right where we were out to the top of the sail. And there's a silver amplifier 50 feet from the end. So when that amplifier came in, he would stop neatly laying it in. I would keep cranking. He would just be doing like that until the tip passed and seal it. Well, just about that. There's the amp. And the last 50 feet came in that fast. And the ocean came in right behind it. Hard enough to knock us down. Knocked us right off our feet. And it's just coming in a half-inch stream. And flooding alarms are going off. And we struggle to our feet. And he goes and tries to get to the valve to shut it, but it can't get there against the water. So I braced myself against the opposite bulkhead. And he braced himself against me. And we were able to get it shut. We looked at each other like, what the hell happened? And in comes, we call it a 5 khaki alarm. 5 officers, there were a bunch of officers, chiefs come in, they're splashing through the water, and the passageway said, what happened? I don't know. What had happened was the junior officer who was running the boat at the time said, retrieve the wire. I thought it was going to magically be retrieved instantly. So he took us down to 400 feet. Well, at 400 feet, when the tip hit the boat, 190 pounds per square inch of sea pressure, pushed the whole thing in and came in right behind it. So, oops.